Ladies and gentlemen, the game of chess, which you and I both love, is extremely complicated. And one of the most complicated things about this game is the endgame phase. First of all, nobody really knows what an endgame is, all right? Nobody's defined it. It's just when some random amount of pieces has been traded off the board, and then you're like, all right, this is an endgame. There's no queens, there's no rooks, whatever. So it's kind of like a vague, arbitrary stage of the game. It's like when enough pieces have been traded off the board, but not too little and not too many, okay? The other thing about endgames is somewhat theoretical. So queen versus pawn, you know, rook versus whatever, bishop or something like that. They're solved. You just have to memorize the technique. But in this video, I'm showing you the other side of those endgames, practical endgames. Many of you have requested this video, and today I have got 7 examples from my own subscriber games, so shout out to them for volunteering these games. We are going to use a little checklist to get better at endgames, all right? First things first, every position we're gonna check in on the king safety and material, all right? All endgames have these two things. Then, should I trade these pieces? How does every trade change the position for myself or for my opponent? A fair trade does not exist in endgames, okay? Piece activity. We're going to be identifying targets in the opponent's position and in our own position on behalf of our opponent and finding what both sides want to play for and what do both sides want, all right? What do both sides want? Sometimes you don't want to win in an endgame. Sometimes you want to draw, right? You're in a worse position or something like that. So without further ado, the first couple of examples I have feature queens, all right? And other amounts of pieces. Now, you'll notice, folks, that in the first endgame we see here, the evaluation is minus 4.7. What? But the material is only up a pawn for black. That is because black has a pass pawn, a protected pass pawn, which can take a couple steps forward and make white defend. Black also has a dominant rook. This rook is stuck. It's never going to get back into the game. The knight can't move a whole lot. So black is winning in terms of a lot of different things here. Black plays the move rook e4. You'll notice that black rushes in to trade a bunch of pieces here and gets a queen endgame. This is an incorrect simplification because the quality of the pieces was not the same. The black rook was a monster. It would have been much better for black to play moves like b4, b3, all right? Trying to use that pawn as a decoy for the white pieces to have to defend. Maybe in the future, you would get a situation that looks something like this, all right? Where the white queen is just permanently stuck guarding that pawn, and black slowly makes some more progress, maybe picks off another weakness, right? Identifying weaknesses around the board. When you simplify into a queen endgame, king safety becomes extremely important. The other pieces can't get to the king that easily, but this king is about to get absolutely bullied. And let's keep in mind, that pawn is a major weakness, all right, for black. These pawns are weaknesses for white, but that pawn is a major weakness for black. And, you know, for example, if white had played the move queen a8 or queen c8 here, white would have been winning, okay? Because if black gets this pawn, white would get, oh, actually, white would win the queen. But let's just say white would win this pawn. Let's say that tactic doesn't exist. White is still winning even without winning the queen. Because this king is so safe, and this pawn's just gonna go. Like, for example, queen d7, you can move your queen and then play a6, a7. Right, so that the way you think about queen endgames is very different than the way you think about endgames with rooks and bishops, because once it's just queens, the fact that your king is so open is a huge problem. That is why black should have been careful about simplifying into that kind of an endgame, right? What do both sides want? Well, white wants to hunt the king and protect their own, and that's what white starts doing. White starts winning a million different pawns, wins the a6 pawn. Now white is a pawn up. All right, now the evaluation is equal because black has to go for perpetual check. Black does not go for perpetual check. Instead, white gives away a couple of pawns of their own. All right, so now white has given away a couple of pawns. It's still equal. It's equal because white should move the queen and try to promote, and black should give perpetual check. That's what both sides want right now. All right, and you'll notice that black is giving a lot of checks. All right, the checks do not stop. It should be a draw, all right? But suddenly queen c5. Now you gotta be really careful. Is this a good trade? No, that trade loses for white because the pawn is stopped, all right? And black's pawns are just gonna roll down the board. So that trade is bad. So we have a couple more checks. Here comes the a pawn. All right, now is this trade good for black? No, because now that pawn is too far. You see, it's a constant question of when you wanna trade pieces, right? Queen c8, checks. All right, queen g4. Now black here has a win. f4 check. f4. Queen is hit. Savage. Black doesn't see it, and the players end up just kind of bouncing around the board and settling for a draw. What did both sides want? White was 2 squares away from making a queen, but the fact that White's king was so weak allowed Black to get back into the game with a draw. Is Black happy with this result? I mean, it depends where you start the position. Black was also -5. Black incorrectly simplified and allowed way too much counterplay, right? So that is one thing we are going to be paying attention to a lot, especially with queens on the board. This next endgame is a little bit more simple. Okay, a little bit more simple. Both kings are a little bit safe, right? I would love it if White played the move h3, for example, and just never got back ranked. Gotham sub in this position as Black, but it doesn't really matter. This is a free pawn for White. White should play that move. Now, Black here should not just sit quietly, because if Black just sits quietly and allows White to, you know, play whatever they want, White's just gonna go a4, a5. Okay? You don't need to give checks. All right? That's not what we want. We need to think about what are we looking for in the endgame. We have a massive asset. The A pawn, A4, A5, A6, has a red carpet to go to the A8 square. A4, Rook A1, get the Rook behind it. B4, A5, right? Well, that doesn't happen. White plays this, then hangs this, and now fantastic move here by Black. Activity! Get active, attack the weak things, right? Now Black has won the A pawn. That's massive, all right? Now Black starts going insane. Black starts moving the king side pawns. Why? Look at the eval now, right? Why? Keep those pawns safe and guard the king. Slowly move the king up the board. Defend everything. It's an equal endgame, but when you play like this, it's going to be anything but equal. Are you crazy? Where are you going? Look how weak the king is. The only reason this isn't losing for Black is because the engine finds a way to create counterplay on White, but Black just goes completely nuts. Black starts throwing every pawn forward and still is very lucky that this queen endgame is equal. Now, at the end of the day, all things simplify down to pawns, right? And you got to be really careful. For example, queen f7, you know, there's a hanging pawn here. Queen f7, king f7 is probably a draw, but you have to be 100% sure. Black gives a lot of checks, simplifies, and then White in the king and pawn endgame, I mean, king and pawn endgames are a zoo. I mean, they're incredibly complicated, super tricky. White should be going for those pawns, and Black should be trying to fight back, all right? Black should play, for example, king f7, and when it's just kings and pawns, you have to start calculating the pawn run, right? The pawn race. If White goes to g5 and then takes, are we sure that this is not losing, right? Right? c5 or maybe even king f5, not letting the king escape. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? And what happens in this game is exactly that. White sort of goes, oh, I'm gonna go win this pawn, and doesn't calculate correctly. 1, 2, 3, 4. You are 1, 2, 3, 4 yourself, but including this and moving out of the way. And yeah, I mean, what White should do here is go king f4, of course, is not allow that pawn to get any closer. Instead of that, White goes here and proceeds to absolutely lose the race. So when it's just kings and pawns, this is where brute force calculation is required. And with low time, it's very difficult. And one of the other reasons that I say be careful how you simplify is all endgames lead to king and pawn endgames. This is one of the most complex endgames to calculate because it could be a 10-move sequence, right? And the 10th move determines if you win or you draw. So be careful how you simplify. A lot of people are trigger happy when they simplify. And also, don't make things more complicated. Don't move all the pawns in front of your king. You have a queen on a2 doing nothing. Bring the queen back, right? Well, what ends up happening in this game, White goes for the pawn, White ends up losing the race, and Black converts. Black does a nice job, gives a lot of checks, and uses the queen, wins the pawn, and this is a theoretical endgame. This is not what I'm covering in this video, but very nice technique here shown. That's it, beautiful, right? So you combine practical with theoretical. And in this game, I mean, it was equal for a while. Black got a little bit too aggressive for their own good. White went to grab a pawn, and now, you know, in pawn endgames, right? You can't go wandering off with the king because the pawn will just come down the board. What do both sides want in that endgame? A draw. That's what both sides truly want with best play. Now, we're gonna scale down a little bit. We're gonna look at Rook endgames. This is an endgame submitted to me. It's a 2-rook endgame with 7 pawns each right now, and White has just played the move Rook d4. Now, if we use that checklist, right, king safety is not important right now. Material is, because White's about to win a pawn and maybe a second one. How does Black get activity in this endgame? This rook is garbage. And white controls the only active files, right? The only active spots. If we also combine this with, what is white's weak spot here? Where is white's weak spot? Well, white's weak spot is right here. That's white's weak spot. This is black's major asset. Black should go rook d5. Because white has two choices. Trade and improve the structure, right? This is an improvement for black. Or take on e4 and allow this. And I'm not sure what's going on in this position anymore. I mean, rook a1 is a depressing move to have to make. This is a massive, massive improvement for black. Okay, you lose one pawn, but black immediately takes control of the entire file. I mean, maybe there's rook a4 coming, but by the time that happens, look at these rooks and look at black's rooks. For the cost of 2 pawns, black gets the rooks on the second rank. This is a nightmare situation for white. And I mean, you might have to give away a pawn. I mean, in the long run, we might get an endgame like this, but this just simplifies out. This is just equal for black. All right, which is why rook d5 and activity is important. c5 is a horrible mistake because these rooks are totally blocked, right? And after something like rook a7, the evaluation's just plus 2.5 because black never was able to activate the rooks and white was dominating for a while. Rook c4 is an atrocious move. You obviously should go here and you're just winning. I mean, you're winning because, again, moves like b4 exist where you have too much pressure. You just have too much pressure, you have too much coordination, and you know what you're playing for. Black begins fighting back. I love this. Rook d7 looking for rook d2. There it is. And now rook c2. And look at this. I mean, for a while, black was just completely lost. Now black is equal. Black is down 3 pawns. 3. But managed to link up on the second rank and now is just bulldozing white. And white is dead lost. White tries to escape, loses 2 pawns, and now is in a mating net. The only thing you have to cover is this. It's very difficult to understand between these two moves which one is better. Apparently, rook b3 wins. Rook b3 is minus 10. White's king is stuck. So white did an excellent job sacrificing material for activity and bullying their opponent's king. King safety is everything, right? And look what happened. But black misses it, and now it's equal again, but black is still better. All right, black is still attacking. Now, things start to go wrong, all right? You have to think about simplifying here. Does black want a rook trade? No, absolutely not. One rook is not going to play defense on its own against 2 passed pawns and a king, all right? Do you simplify? No, your rooks must stay together here if you're playing black because you need to create counterplay, all right? Now black starts to go wrong again, and white begins... here, I have no clue why white did not go rook e4. White loses a pawn, runs all the way in, and gets the pawn to the other side of the board. Black misses mate in 1 because they're my subscriber, and that's what my subscribers do. And, I mean, you know, now we have this endgame, which is like the weirdest endgame ever. But it's still, again, black is still playing for a win here because of things like rook a2. So you get the pawn. This is now totally winning for black because not only are you a pawn up, the enemy king is totally cut off. So black needs to play king f5, king g4, for example. Black should play king f5, okay, king g4, and h4. Use the pawn to break up the structure, totally winning endgame, hunt the pawns, promote the pawns. Instead of that, you start giving checks. Why? Why are you letting the king back in the game? Keep the king cut off. Keep the king cut off, right? You're letting the king get back into the game. So that's not good. The king does get back into the game, and by the time you create counterplay, you're losing all your... right? This wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened if you had controlled your opponent's movement. But now white is winning if white plays f5 and tries to promote themselves, but black hangs a rook. So, you know, all good endgames must come to an end, right? I mean, there you go. And now we have just a totally winning endgame for black, who proceeds to win the game, and and white loses. So sacrificing material for massive amounts of activity, not sitting there passively. And we're going to take a look at 2 more examples that feature rooks and other pieces. So this endgame featured rook and bishop versus rook and knight. First things first, black is a pawn up. Number 1, all right? King safety, about equal. If I have to choose one, I would say white's king is actually even weaker than black's king because it's going to be really difficult for this knight to get in. White plays a3. And now rook f8, rook e2, and king g7. So this position is winning for black, okay? Now, black has a couple of options. That pawn is hanging. You can play the move rook b8, which they did in the game. But we just talked about piece activity. Do you really want to do that? That is one of the most depressing looking moves ever. No, you don't want to play rook b8. No, that pawn is not worth it. What is the strongest thing about black's position? Pawn imbalance. Make a pass pawn. Make a pass pawn. Why? Because if this pawn gets attacked and taken, it's -5. D3, you cannot go here. D2, or even rook f2. But like, come on. This is horrible for white. Awful. Rook e8, rook e1. The game is over. That's it. I mean, you just win, right? So find your strong point. Your strong point can sometimes be creating a pass pawn. And then it's very difficult to, rook b8 is a last resort. Oh my goodness, don't play moves like this. Now white is just very active, right? White is just happily enjoying themselves some activity. All right, a4 is, no. What is this rook doing? That is not an active rook. Get the rook back on an open file, right? a4 is just a do-nothing move. And now rook a8, the rook can break free. All right, black plays h5. Get the rook on an open file. No, don't make unnecessary random pawn moves. What are we doing? This is the most powerful piece that black has, and it's stuck in timeout, right? Finally, black is like, all right, you can take my pawn. White doesn't even take it. White tries to block the rook, which actually is the best move. Again, too many unnecessary pawn moves. Can you, for the love of God, play the move rook e2 or rook b2? Yes, rook b2 would have also been good. Great. Rook e7, get in there. Rook e4 is also good. And notice how quickly the position is just falling apart for black, because black just didn't build around their strong suit, pushed a bunch of pawns and created weaknesses. If we go back like 10 moves, black had such a nice structure, nothing was weak. You should have built around the strong point of your position, which is your potential pass pawn. Instead of that, black just scattered their pawns, created a bunch of weaknesses, and started to lose all their pawns, right? Knight h4, look at, now it's a losing king and rook endgame. Now, rook endgames are very difficult. You have to know the Philidor position, but you cannot simplify into 2-on-1 endgame. This is horrible. I want this video to serve as like a little checkpoint for you to never do that. You can absolutely never play the move rook b4 in this position. That is an atrocious move. No. You lose this endgame 100 times out of 100, okay? I need you all to keep rooks on, check, here, harass the targets, right? Rook b7, this is a draw. But you cannot do this because then white just goes forward, all right? And hopefully doesn't stalemate you. But in this game, actually, that's exactly what happens. White needed in this position to go this way, leave the pawn, and just go for that pawn. But okay, you know, that also doesn't happen. It's stalemate now of king g6. Now, this is a draw, but black doesn't know how to draw this endgame and probably will lose it, or maybe won't, or will. It's stalemate. So the sides didn't even know. This is the one time out of 100 that you cannot force this through, all right? You have to use the g-pawn as a decoy and go win the other pawn. They didn't know, all right? That's why you're watching this video. But this is a theoretical endgame. This is not a practical endgame, but you must know how to win this, or else you will not know how to win some of the other stuff, okay? So we have to have the foundation of winning these positions. Okay, sounds good? Next one I have for you. This one, also rooks and minor pieces, okay? This is the endgame. Now, what should you be trading here? Well, you have rook c8 and you have targets. So bishop c3 is a good move because it just creates weaknesses, and rook c8 immediately takes advantage of that. Just winning material. Just at least the pawn, and then you play this position. Instead of that, black tries to trade like this and just straight up loses a pawn. That is inexcusable. Do not do that. Now, I like king f7, all right? Now, white is just a pawn up. What does white want in this position? To slowly improve, disallow the rook from getting to the second rank, okay? So slowly improve. And actually, for a while, white was doing that. Watch what white is doing here. Very slow improvement. Now, you might be wondering, knight e4 check, is this winning? Probably. Yeah, f4 just wins a bishop. So it's never too late for there to be tactics and endgames. If you notice that an enemy piece doesn't have a lot of moves, you should still look to create maximum danger. But that doesn't happen, all right? And here is the winning moment for white, all right? White gets right here, and after watching this video, you must get this move right 100% of the time. White to move and win. What is the 100% certified move, guaranteed move to win the game for white here? Activity. Activity and targets. Don't even think. Rook e7, the game is over. It's not even the fact that it's a fork, it's just, it's gotta be the move. Do not give empty checks, do not push pawns for no reason. Don't just, oh, it's a check. Why? But now you have to, like, now black checks, and black actually has a very active rook. b5 is a little crazy, but it works. b5 is a little bit unnecessary, but it's still getting the job done. And then just, you're just losing another pawn. I mean, it's just inexcusable, right? Like, well, white, yeah, this happens, and it's a 2-on-2 now. All right, it's a 2-on-2, so this is a big thing. You can't let them get that, so you gotta go rook b1. All right, or that. King f5, great. Rook a4, great. And immediately loses. Just loses the game. And, I mean, black played so well. Here, you just have to take this first. I mean, black just forgot that the pawn would... I don't know. I mean, black just... If black had played like this, folks, what is the best move here for white? Is it to trade the rooks? Probably not. Because if you go here, you just lose. At least if you go rook g3, you might draw the game. I mean, I'm not saying you will... Engine thinks you're losing, but what if they don't know how to win this position, right? You can't trade into a totally lost position. And yeah, I mean, black just, right? You can't simplify in a losing way. The easiest way to win queen versus pawn is just to get in front of the pawn, but white will win this game, right? White's gonna win, right? Right? Perfect. All right, it's gonna be made pretty soon. So that was, that was an example of rooks and pieces. Okay, rooks and pieces, rook, bishop, rook, knight. Knight versus bishop, we're gonna cover a little bit more in the next couple of examples. But in general, when you have like rooks and bishops, or rooks and knights, simplifying and creating weaknesses is the #1 way to go. But the other thing is activating your pieces to the maximum ability. These pieces have been activated to the best of their ability. Like, it does not get any better than this. At some point, you have to create change in the position and create winning chances for yourself. And that is exactly what happened. You'll notice that white, right here, was like, knight e4 check is probably winning. It's just probably winning, right? Simplifying, rook e7 down, and winning the game. Knight versus bishop is a age-old tale, right? It's an age-old battle, and here's like the cleanest example of it. Okay, this is just a draw, right? This is just a totally equal position. These are 1500 rated players, identical pawn structure, imbalance of opposite colored bishops. Most opposite colored bishops are draws, right? So let's see what happens here. All right, players are shuffling. First thing I notice is that there are light squared problems, right? Now, the other thing that happens here is black plays knight h5, which is just an obscure move. Like, why would you damage your structure like this? There is no need to do that. But okay, fine. It's still a draw because look at this. Like, this is a complete blockade by black. This is just, the game is over, right? There's nothing you can do here. And then black starts getting a bit goofy. They start trading pawns, okay? Now white's king gets active. And here, black just completely loses their mind. This king is now extremely central and can walk in, by the way. Well, staying patient, fine. And then what is black doing? What? Why? Black loses a pawn. Not only does black lose a pawn, white just has a passed a pawn now. So it's a completely winning position for white. All white has to do is make sure that their weak spot does not get targeted, and black cannot sneak through one of the pawns. Now, the rest of this endgame is actually absolute pandemonium, okay? Complete I love this. Get the king in there. Beautiful. Yes. Why? Where? Move the king in more. Move the king in more. King b5. All right? I mean, you can take this if you want. All right? But apparently black can hold this. Stockfish thinks there might be some holding chances, but you're getting another pawn. I mean, what are we doing? Bishop b5. Now, for some reason, white stops pushing this. White gets really passive, lets the king come in, and then the king, no, we don't want that pawn. We wanted to promote this. The king was right there. The king should have kicked out the bishop and promoted. That's what the king is for. Apparently not. White goes all the way over there and wins that pawn. Now apparently black is equal. Oh my goodness. Black is equalized. King b4, that's it. Just go back. King c3, bishop b4, it's a draw. That's what you want right now. That's what you want. You want to draw. You want to go here. The white bishop can't guard both pawns. Black plays c3. Why? Why is black playing c3? Does black really think that they're going to win this pawn? Of course they're not. It's defended. And now white can use the a pawn as a decoy and win the h pawn and promote. Instead of that, instead of playing just push the pawn, get this 2-0. This is guarded. Go. Instead of that, white does this. Oh my goodness. Okay. Black wins the a pawn. It's now a draw. It's now a draw. The black king needs to run back and the bishop will cover promotion. That's what's going to happen right now. All right. Instead of that, the bishop walks directly into the king's path. Directly into the king's path. You can't do this, folks. Can't do this. And apparently this is still a fortress. This is still, maybe not anymore. Maybe not anymore. All right. And game ends here. And, white makes it all the way back, wins the pawn. And now this is a winning endgame. It takes 90 moves, but white gets the job done. Black did not need to do any of that. Black created way too many weaknesses and then was playing and then damaged their own pawn structure and then just overextended with their pawns for no reason. Black is stronger on the dark squares. Why are you playing on the light squares? For what? For what, right? Just make the draw and be careful how you allow the king to infiltrate your position. Too many pawns on the same color here and no respect for the color complex, right? So bishop endgames are tricky, especially opposite colored bishops, but you can't just let the enemy king into your territory. The king will become the hero in endgames that don't involve queens and that don't involve queens and rooks, all right? King has to be protected in those endgames. But when there's bishops on the board and knights on the board, the king will become the hero if you're not careful. Now, another example here. All right, black is a pawn up. Pawn up. That's why the eval is minus 1.5. How should black play this position? All right, the bishops are not very good. The knight should be planted in the center of the board. That knight is a superstar. Now, in a perfect situation for black, perfect situation, the knight plays against this bishop. Okay, not opposite colored bishops. We just talked about this. So imagine we get to an endgame that looks like this. There are higher drawing chances here because the bishops are on opposite colors. What you want to do is get that same color bishop off the board, and in a perfect situation, you have a knight that cannot be touched. All right? This bishop cannot touch that knight. Plant the knight in the middle, glue it in with a couple of pawns, the game will play itself. All right? The game will play itself. This knight is a killer. Absolute killer. What happens in this endgame? Black plays, I don't even know what king g8 does. And after playing king g8, black traps their own rook. Come on, folks. This is crazy. This is crazy, right? So the bishop is strong in the middle. It would have been better to just immediately go to the e-file, right? To double on the e-file. And you have to constantly ask yourself here, is one rook trade good? Is both rook trades good, right? Should I trade both rooks? In this game, there's a very nice counterattack, and the players just trade all their rooks. But remember, people love to trade without thinking how it evaluates this position. In this case, with the absence of the rooks, white's drawing chances are higher. They're higher. If the rooks had stayed on the board, white's drawing chances would have been lower. Okay? So it's actually better here for white to trade all the rooks, I think. It's better for white to have traded all the rooks. For black, it would have been better to keep more rooks on because you're able to apply more pressure. All right, rooks can work together. What happens is, all right, I'm trying to simplify this down, bishop d3. Now, white here should play bishop b3 because that pawn is a liability for black. For example, that pawn can immediately fall, right? So that pawn, you should look at it, right? White plays bishop d8 right away, but that just allows a4. That just allows a4, and now after b3, that pawn isn't going to be lost. You need to. White saw this, but didn't see this first. Okay, so that pawn gets traded. Now black plays bishop c4. Okay, bishop d1. Remember, not all trades are the same. This trade is not good for white. You got to be really careful because that knight, if it gets to d5 and c3 played, very bad situation. So actually, the engine, the more it thinks, seems to think that this is okay for white, but white chooses not to trade. I would recommend, again, you have to evaluate what trades are good, what trades are bad. It might have actually been a lesson there for black not to rush the trade. Not to rush the trade because you're not getting the queen here. Maybe black thought they were getting the queen. Don't rush with your trades, okay? Bishop d3, bishop g4, uh-oh. 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 And f5 played, nice move. Where's the knight going? For example, here, if white plays bishop takes e8, white probably saves the game. Opposite colored bishops, this is probably unlosable. You just can't lose this. Opposite colored bishops, all the pawns are on the opposite color square, right? That's how you're supposed to play endgames. Instead of that, white just kind of keeps moving, and here black does something very bad and gets their pawn structure messed up. Not only does black get their pawn structure messed up, this bishop is on the same color, and white has to move g4. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. You can't move this. Now, folks, million-dollar question. Should black trade bishops? Everything that you've learned so far in today's video, should black trade the bishops? In the game, black did trade the bishops. Black should not trade the bishops. This is a completely lost pawn endgame. Why? No space. White's king can just go over here. That's what's going to happen. Or white's king can go over there. This is just not an endgame that you can defend, okay? And what happens in this game is, unfortunately, that black plays h5, white plays with the king, runs the king over, gets the king all the way to the queen side, and that's it. Just losing, because a pawn, king will go here. Right? King goes for, king should have gone to c5, now it does, wins this, and the pawn promotes, and black resigns. Black was winning in this game, but did something really, really bad. They traded way too quickly. They were forced to trade all the pieces, and then their knight never got active. The black knight just never activated. Black should have been much faster. g5, knight g7, knight e6. Look how quickly this game could have turned around. Like, let's say, you know, h3, knight e6, kick out the bishop, all right? Slowly but surely improve. You know, by the time that we get into this endgame, I mean, look at this, it's minus 3. But black never did that. Black tried to get a couple of trades, that didn't work, and then proceeded to get their pawn structure damaged, and then simplified into a losing endgame. So, this video is a checklist, if you will. It's something that you should pay attention to throughout the endgames that you find yourself battling in. Again, I want to remind you, at every stage of the endgame, you need to think about who's up and is my king safe, right? That's number one. Just always, who's up? Should I make that trade? If I make that trade, what happens to my pawn structure? If I make that trade, am I removing one of my most active pieces, right? Piece activity. Am I putting this rook in an ultra passive situation, right? Am I defending this one pawn, which I don't need to necessarily? Strong and weak points. Oh, my opponent's pawn over there is extremely weak. I should find a way to activate my pieces and get there. Wait a minute, I think I have a couple of weak points. This pawn over here, maybe my king. I gotta make sure that my opponent doesn't coordinate all their pieces onto that weak point in my position. And last but not least, you gotta ask, what do both sides want? Like, what do both sides want? Does one side want to draw? Do I want to draw? Don't force things if they're not there. These are the steps that you need to take to become a better practical endgame player, okay? And I would love it if certain endgames had certain things and certain criteria that others didn't. I can't always guarantee you that, all right? I can tell you that in queen and rook endgames, king safety matters more than in knight and bishop endgames because queens and rooks are more capable of attacking enemy kings, for example. But other than that, it's like a little bit kind of hard to do, right? Opposite colored bishop endgames. If you have a way to avoid them, you probably should. Get a knight versus bishop endgame instead. Get a same colored bishop endgame instead. Other than that, be very careful what you simplify down into king and pawn. Once you're at king and pawn, there's no going back. Before that, there is going back. You have other pieces on the board, you can still make draws. Folks, I hope this was useful. Let me know your feedback in the comments, and I look forward to making and getting back on the educational content grind for all of you. Now you know how to play endgames like Magnus, or at least not as bad as you did before this video started. I'll see you in the next video. Get out of here.